In this first lecture of the quarter, we want to talk about what we do in archaeology and how we do it. And the reason we're talking about this in a prehistory class is because I think it's important to understand how we collect the data, who are the individuals doing it, how do we do it, what's our theoretical framework, and things like that, to really understand the interpretations that we're going to talk about later in the quarter when we get to our regional survey of prehistory. So let's jump right into it. Now, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but we will not be talking about dinosaurs in this class. That is not a part of human prehistory because humans never coexisted with dinosaurs. The field of study that would cover dinosaurs would be paleontology. I don't believe, really like to be called archaeologists, and I know archaeologists don't like to be referred to as dinosaur hunters. So sorry, no dinosaur fossils in this particular class. We'll also be trying to dispel the myth of Indiana Jones as the typical archaeologist. Yes, archaeologists have a little bit of a loner streak, a little bit of a wild side, because we do sometimes find ourselves out in some unusual places, but Indiana Jones was really a pot hunter. He kind of personifies that a little bit. So archaeology and Indiana Jones, yeah, not really so much anymore the norm. So what is archaeology? Well, archaeology is simply the study of the human past using material remains. Now, this can be the very distant past, which, if we go back to the first evidence of material culture, we're talking about 2.5 million years, or it can be the relatively recent past, where we have archaeologists in Arizona doing the Garbology project. So they're looking at how people dispose of things, what they dispose of, and kind of using that to develop models to help us explain more distant behavior. So basically, archaeology is the science of rubbish. So how does this differ from history? Well, there's some debate going on as to what this actually constitutes. However, for most archaeologists, this is material remains versus recorded remains. I don't want that to make it sound like archaeologists never use recorded remains, because we do, but we incorporate that with the material remains that we find for corroboration, right? Because historical texts can be biased. So we try to use the material remains to kind of support or to disprove things that are being said in the historical record. Now, the historical record can be both an oral tradition or it can be a written tradition. But again, what constitutes writing is another big debate. So if we're going to look at something like petroglyphs, which is rock writing, which we see in this left-hand picture, is that writing? It is telling us something, but is it what we would consider writing? And the same with the marking of time on this piece of bone in the right-hand side. Is that considered then recorded history as well? So the debate goes on as to what is the difference between archaeology and history. Archaeology has three primary objectives. Now, this is not in your textbook, but I think it's important to think about. The one is to reconstruct culture history. So what happened where and when. So we want to establish a chronology. Even if it's not specific dates, kind of an order of how things happen. And that's what it does. It provides an order for the archaeological record. And the archaeological record is simply the material remains that people leave behind. We can study this by looking at sites. We can arrange them then in local and regional sequences through the use of stratigraphy and cross-site dating and a variety of different kinds of relative and absolute dating techniques, which we'll talk about in a separate lecture. Part of this also is, we need to establish time to address evolutionary questions. This is what's going to give us a more historical perspective of human behavior. The second objective is to reconstruct past lifeways. So here's where we address anthropological questions about human behavior. So we determine what the culture was like, what their behaviors were, using the artifacts that they left behind. And artifacts are the material remains of human behavior. So with the artifacts, we can look at things, hopefully, like mating patterns, family structure, religion, subsistence, and we could go on from there. And we try to do this in a culturally relative manner. So cultural relativism simply means trying to understand human behavior within its cultural context. And this can be a really hard thing to do, even if you're not trying to put together a picture of past behavior. It can be hard to do with modern behavior, but we work hard at it, and we do attempt to try to understand things within their cultural context. The third objective is to study culture process. We want to understand the diversity of human cultures, so we want to know how and why they changed. So, for example, after tens of thousands of years of foraging or hunting and gathering subsistence practices, why did we switch to a sedentary agricultural lifeway? And why has virtually every civilization or state level society collapsed? So these are some big questions, but this is what we're talking about: culture process. What led up to the collapse of a civilization? What led up to the switch to agricultural lifeways? And we'll actually talk about some of those particular theories later on in the quarter. Now, these three objectives, they kind of flow into one another. They're not mutually exclusive. So studying the lifeways depends on an accurate reconstruction of culture history. Culture process requires large quantities of cultural history, environmental, and lifeway data to be meaningful. So it's not like we do one to the exclusion of the others. We work on them all at the same time. And we're trying to do all of this, meet all of these objectives of archaeology using just fragments of the past. So imagine an archaeologist in the future trying to reconstruct our society based on 2 spark plugs, some beer cans, some fragments of plastic bottles, a Barbie doll, and some parts of hubcaps. So it can be really difficult and it can be really frustrating, so it's not really easy. And it's kind of like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle with only some of the pieces. But even with the frustrations, it can be incredibly rewarding, not necessarily financially, because archaeologists don't own the artifacts, but it can be really awe-inspiring. And I consider it a privilege to be able to investigate the lifeways of the people of the past, and it helps connect us more closely with our past. So how do we start to do this? Well, archaeologists employ the scientific method. So we do problem identification. So we work from a hypothesis. And for instance, we can look at something like settlement patterns in the Ohio River Valley. So let's say I was walking around doing a surface survey along the Scioto River in central Ohio, and I noticed scatters of artifacts instead of big clumps of artifacts. Then I might come up with a hypothesis, something about the facts that the inhabitants of central Scioto River Valley returned to a mobile lifeway. So that would be one example. We're going to determine our theoretical framework. And the reason we're going to do this is it helps to define terminology and methodology. It provides a framework for our research. So for instance, if I was going to use a selectionist approach, and we're going to talk about this later in this lecture, I would want to try to answer the question, why did people return to a mobile lifeway, if that's indeed what happened? So I would have very specific kinds of data that I would be looking for. It would give me a whole kind of evolutionary terminology to use. Or I could take just a strict culture history approach, which is, establishing that chronology, what happened first, and so forth. The next thing we do is gather data. We make our observations. So this is the field work. This is the part of archaeology that everybody thinks about when they think archaeology. So we determine our project area, then we can go do survey, surface collection, excavation. This is where you get to get dirty, and it really is, some of the fun stuff of archaeology. But it's not the bulk of the work. The bulk of the work happens in the next step when we come back to the lab and we start to interpret our data. So what is everything that we collected telling us? So for instance, if I was looking at this settlement pattern problem again, if during the survey I found a number of small artifact clusters with a very wide distribution, then that may indicate a mobile lifeway. Then we're going to test our hypothesis, and we can use this by using models developed from other sites. We can go out and enlarge our survey area, conduct further excavation, see if we're falsified or not falsified. And then finally we're going to either, one, refine our hypothesis if we find that our original hypothesis was falsified, and we can start the process again by retesting, and we should publish no matter what happens. Even if we have falsified data, we can get that out there for people to examine. We can get our unfalsified data out there for people to critique and really give it a good scholarly once over. So that's basically the scientific process, an example of how it would work in archaeology.